Awesome. Good morning, everybody. Well, it could be an afternoon, but I think it's mostly everybody's morning. But welcome to our webcast today. My name is Courtney Pilata. I am on the marketing team at EverDriven, and we have an absolutely fantastic session planned today to talk a little bit more about the SB 88 regulation and its impact on your school transportation plans for next year. 2 comments, housekeeping, before we turn it over to our presenters. Please feel free to chat any questions into the Q&A, and we will either get to them live today or we will make sure you get a response as a follow-up. And the recording, as well as the resources we talk about at the end of the call, will be shared via email after today's session. So with that, we hope you enjoy the content. Please don't hesitate to ask your questions. We'd love to continue the dialogue, and I will turn it over to Megan Carey.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. And welcome everyone to the webinar where we will be doing a deep dive on SB 88 that was passed obviously earlier this year with a compliance date that is soon approaching of July 1st. So there's been many questions and concerns about SB 88. So CASTO's put together what I must say is an amazing lineup of professionals here in California. So let's get into it. I'm going to start by let's meet the panel that's going to be chatting here with us today. First, we have Dr. LaFaye Platter. LaFaye is a leadership consultant and former superintendent of human resources. I would say she's a true guru of HR here in the state of California. So I know many people look up to her and love her advice. So we're lucky to have her. Next, we have Kevin Gordon, also does not need much of an introduction, but Kevin is the president at Capital Advisors Group, which leads in California as advocates for education. So they've done so much great work here across the state. Next, we have Rich Jimenez, which is the Director of Transportation for Placentia Yorba Linda Unified School District, a district that has both in-house drivers that are affected by this bill, but also they do outsourcing with vendors as well. So 2 ways of ensuring compliance that Rich and his team have coming up on their plate. Next, we have David Neben. David is a partner at Capital Advisor and also CASTO's legislative representative. So thank you, David, for being here. Kelly Rem is next. Kelly is an attorney with Lozano Smith, where she's been working really with the public sector of school districts for well over a decade. Really specializes in the facility and the business issues with school districts. So. And then lastly, myself, I'm Megan Carey. I'm the advisor to the CEO here at EverDriven, which is the largest alternative transportation company in the US that really started here in California over 20 years ago now. So, and we only transport students in alternative vehicles like we're going to be talking about today. So I've been working with districts in this space here in California for 18 years myself. So this is near and dear to my heart. Next, let's get into the agenda for today real quick. First of all, we are going to go through key provisions surrounding SB 88. Second, practical steps for a successful implementation, obviously. And then we're going to go through some actionable items to navigate SB 88 and protect your students, your staff, the district, risk mitigation, really. At the end, we are going to be providing and sending out a compliance checklist, as well as an attestation form, so that you can really prepare for your compliance and actual implementation in just a few short weeks that are coming up here. We wanted to give you some actionable takeaways that we believe will be very helpful. Now, before I hand it off to Kevin and David, I also wanted to give a quick little backstory on why it was decided to put on this webinar. So if you go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more, just a tiny little bit of the backstory. At the latest CASBO conference, there was, I would say, some concerns around implementation of this bill, not only from a transportation end, from an HR end, from a procurement end, and really just even that kind of accountability standpoint. So we really hope that this webinar will solve for many of those concerns out there. And second, I think most know, for the majority of districts out there, you know, the out-of-district placement has risen over the last decade or so, as well as transportation requests for students experiencing homelessness and students that are in the foster youth, both falling under the McKinney-Vento Act. So with a larger need for many of these student populations to be transported in these smaller capacity vehicles, a larger need came for safety measures on both the driver end, obviously, but also the vehicle end, which is why this bill came about. So this is now about implementation and mitigating your risk if you are not in compliance. So the panelists on the webinar, going forward here, we're going to start talking about providing the requirements. What are those requirements? What are the next steps and best practices? So district personnel, everyone on this call can make sure that this change is made effectively and confidently. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kevin and David.
Great, terrific. Well, thank you so much, Megan. Appreciate it. And I think one of the things I wanted to just sort of give some acknowledgement on is CASBO's role in helping us bring this to you today. They're a leader and they're on the cutting edge of so many different issues that affect us in school business, and school transportation is part of that. And then David for CASTO to be part of this. You know, the key is trying to be have some coherence here across the different organizations that have a stake in driving education transportation policy. And obviously SB 88 had a lot of controversy when the bill was first being run. And you know, when it started out, we had our, you know, our labor partners and other people that were involved with the legislation, and lots of different motivations for different folks to be involved with it. But at the end of the day, what we wanted to make sure was that LEAs had plenty of flexibility to be working with, obviously, volunteer parents and that sort of thing. But that if we were going to have any, you know, contracts with anybody that's going to be driving around our kids, we needed a modicum of some standards to make sure that our kids are in a safe setting and they have those expectations. But like always, you know, there's some tendency to overreach when people start getting into the regulatory sort of mood, if you will. And SB 88 still has some issues that need to be addressed and potentially cleaned up. So I wanted to make sure you guys knew that was happening, but also just a little bit of that legislative history is that, you know, on the legislation, again, what I think the goal was by the time this thing got to the governor's desk was trying to strike that balance. The motivation for bringing all of us together today was because we know that the provisions of the bill take effect and that people are going to be looking at you to the degree to which you're in compliance. And what we really want to just do is make sure that everybody knows kind of what the rules are, what you got to comply with. And that definitely will highlight and lead to probably follow-up legislation or cleanup that we may need to do to clarify some things that need to be worked on. And I know that right now there are a lot of advocates that are working with the California Department of Education relative to some of the material that they've put on the web that that we're not so sure represents the spirit or intent of the legislation, but we're going to be working with them to make sure that's clearer for you as well. So you'll be able to get a really good perspective, a lot of the different nuances of SB 88 that you need to know. But then what we really wanted to do is basically underscore that there are issues that remain that we definitely know that we need to tackle. And then maybe some of you with your questions and some of your input with us directly will help inform us about anything that you think we ought to be working on as well. With that, I just toss it over to David to see if, David, you had any other things that you wanted to make anybody aware of or comment on with regard to CASTO's leadership and involvement with the issue.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, just to highlight, you know, a couple of the pieces that you had mentioned, that this is still an ever-changing and evolving situation, you know, with SB 88 and the implementation of SB 88. But to keep in mind that this is still a public process, and it still requires, you know, the input of every component of the public sector. So, you know, as you have concerns and as you have anything that comes up with the implementation, you know, make sure that you're engaging in the public process to ensure that your opinions are, you know, noted by those who are eventually in charge and responsible for any of the cleanup that Kevin had mentioned. But as for CASTO's role, you know, CASTO maintains its moniker as safeguarding the children from home to school to activities to their final destination and back home again. And so, you know, we continue to monitor how SB 88's implementation in just underscores the safety of children at the end of the day. So with that, happy to turn it back over. Thank you, Kevin.
Right, yep. All right, Megan, and I'll wait and see if there's any other questions or anything that might be in the chat that we can answer, if there end up being anything.
Courtney, if you move on to the next slide, we did want to put up, we have both David's email here. Obviously, you can reach out to him as a CASTO representative, and then Sarah's with CASBO. So there's a couple emails for you guys to reach out for some of those concerns that you do have, because while we are here today, obviously, to kind of go through implementation of this, what does implementation look like? We do understand that there's still as many concerns that have already been brought up about some of the parts of the bill, and as both Kevin and David mentioned, those things are being addressed. So if you have other concerns yourself, go ahead and reach out to both these contacts, and they're great representatives, and I know both are extremely helpful. So with that, you can go on to the next slide, and I think we're handing it over to Rich and Kelly.
Thank you, Megan. So here you'll see we're going to go over the key differences. We did a side-by-side comparison of what school bus drivers versus the SB 88 drivers. And so the side-by-side comparison highlights the key differences between the two. And this law was, I just want to keep in mind that the law was enacted to as this use of alternative vehicles grew and grew significantly across the state. There needed to be some guidelines set and some regulations set just so that we can ensure that there's safe transportation for our students. So as we review the chart, you'll notice that while both laws required a clean driving record, for instance, first aid certification, background checks, there are notable distinctions between licensing, training hours, inspection protocols. For example, school bus drivers must hold a Class B commercial license with the specific endorsements, whether air brake, passenger endorsement, etc., and undergo a minimum of 40 hours of training that's within their curriculum mandated by the Department of Ed. In contrast with the SB 88 drivers, they may operate just under a standard Class C license for their appropriate vehicle class, and their training is more based on proficiency rather than a set number of hours. The law just call out some categories for the type of training that they have to cover, such as pre-trip inspections, safe loading and unloading, proper use of seatbelts and child safety restraints, going over accidents and emergency procedures, providing accommodations for pupil with disabilities. That's going to handle some of the pupil management side, defensive driving, of course, inclement weather, impaired visibility conditions, maintaining log sheets. Some of this we already have existing for LEAs that already currently have school bus, internal school bus drivers and school buses. And so we can copy some of that curriculum that we already have and use it for these drivers. If we're looking at internal drivers that or coaches or certificated personnel that are going to fall under the criteria of SB 88. There is also a medical examination, although both school bus drivers and drivers that fall under the SB 88 will have to have the medical exam, and that person that's conducting the medical exam does have to be on that medical registry. I think the key difference is for the drivers under SB 88, we don't have to submit that medical to Department of Motor Vehicles. That's a big thing. With commercial drivers, we know that we do have to do that, of course. And there's the background check, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. We'll also have to do with the EPN, also known as the Employee Pull Notice Program. We do have to check that, making sure that they have a safe and clean driving record. Although I'll cover the drug and alcohol because I think Callie can jump in on here and see if she has anything to add to that. But there's a lot of the and we'll go over vehicle equipment in another slide, or vehicle requirements and equipment in another slide. But there is similarities to the maximum duty hours, such as the driving hours. They can only drive for 10 hours, be on the clock maximum of 16 hours with the following 8 hours off before clocking into their next job. But although both commercial drivers, school bus drivers, and the SB 88 drivers, they do have to do a drug and alcohol screening. The bus drivers fall under the federal regulation, the DOT regulation for drug screening, where this is more of a California SB 88 unique issue. And so a lot of questions I know within our industry, in the transportation industry, is do the drivers have to comply with now that marijuana is legal, and we have government code 12954, which states that an employer can't discriminate for the use of cannabis off the job and away from the workplace. So Callie, is there any guidance or any information that you can give us in relation to, can LEAs still enforce the use of cannabis under maybe current board policies or administrative regulations?
Sure. Thank you, Rich. I think so. Just to kind of set the stage on this issue, because we've seen questions about it as well. And I'll just say that with a lot of this, because the law, which we'll talk about when it becomes operative and what it applies to, but technically has not become operative yet. There's a lot of open questions at the moment. But regarding the drug and alcohol testing specifically, the interesting thing with SB 88, is that it refers back to the vehicle code section that then refers to federal regulations. So this kind of is going to get into the interplay between state and federal law as it relates to drug and alcohol testing. Because as you probably know, federal regulation considers cannabis-related, products to be controlled substances, and which are legal in California. And as Rich mentioned, we have Government Code Section 12954, which makes it unlawful for any employer to discriminate based on a person's off-duty cannabis use. And so the way that that might come up is that there could be drug and alcohol testing done pursuant to state and federal law that tests for cannabis and may result in showing that there are, I have to look at the specific, non-psychoactive cannabis metabolites in a person's system, which shows that they have used cannabis substances, but that it's been metabolized and they are likely no longer impaired. So my take on all of that is that the drug testing is still required. It can still test likely for those cannabis substances, but to the extent it's metabolized form of THC or other marijuana substances, then no discrimination can be imposed against that particular person. That's unclear and unsettled at this point because, again, this is all new. It's also possible that there could be some implications to collecting that information at all. I also know that the legislation talked about scientific advances in testing for presence of THC and actually being able to tell if somebody is impaired versus testing for the metabolites of that. So it's all evolving area. SB 88 does specifically say that the drug and alcohol testing is subject to that government code limitation. And so to me, that means that you can still do the testing, you just can't discriminate against the person based on finding those substances in their system.
Thank you. And I do want to emphasize that although there's the drug and alcohol component for SB drivers, it does have to be in a separate random pool than the bus drivers. It can't be in the same pool. You'll have to, whoever's handling that part for you, whether it's an on-site vendor that comes to your site or you're using an off-site facility, you want to distinguish that those drivers that falling under the SB 88 are in a different pool than the commercial drivers. And also again, we'll go over the applicable vehicles on vehicles carrying 10 or few versus the 8 versus anything more than that. Callie, do you have anything to add to the side-by-side?
Just super quick thing I wanted to add, because I think that we get a lot of questions and confusion about the number of passengers. And I just want to say, while there might be slight nuances between each category, this really applies to any person who's being compensated to transport pupils, unless an exception applies. So don't get too bogged down in 10 or fewer, 8 or fewer, and all those different things, because I think that can create a lot of confusion. There may be some nuances there, but it is applicable to any person who's being compensated to transport pupils, unless an exception applies. And I know that we've got questions about exceptions, which we will be covering.
Thank you. Next slide, please. And so there's some requirements that we do have to comply with 88, and it talks about the contracts. And so any existing contracts that signed before January 1st, 2024 are not subject to the requirements unless those agreements expire or renew. And then at that point, we are subject. All other provisions will go into effect July 1st, 2025. However, if you have an RFP or bid or just an agreement, and it expires, before that January 1st, 2025, we do got to comply. If it expires after the requirement deadline, which is January 1st, at that point, we're looking at, is it best practice just to make sure that the vendor's compliant, and we'll talk about the attestation piece in a minute. But we want to make sure that we review all our current agreements. And it's not only with maybe like a EverDriven vendor or other vendors, but we might have a non-public school that has their own vehicles, and maybe especially on the transportation personnel, we may not know that MPS has their own vehicles and they're transporting their own students or our students that are attending there. And so we want to make sure that even in our agreements for the non-public schools or residential treatment facilities, that we're making sure that they're going to meet that criteria too. So it's a good option to review all our agreements on when they expire. Callie, do you have anything to add in this area?
No, I think you covered that well. Just making sure that you're all set up for the July 1st deadline. But if you do have an existing contract that was entered into prior to January of 2024, then you don't need to worry about amending those contracts until they expire or are being renewed.
Right. Next slide, please. Exemptions to SB 88. I'm sure there won't be any questions in relation to this, but it is essential to recognize that all individuals transporting students are subject to this bill. The law only applies to individuals who are compensated. I know Kelly mentioned that earlier. And some of the exemptions are, employees who are driving that are compensated by the LEA, but driving under 40 hours per school year. But that's when that LEA makes a reasonable effort to secure a driver who meets the requirements of this article. And they must notify parents. Again, that's a lot of questions. This applies to certificated staff and classified staff as well. But I want to be clear though, if we have certain policies or administrative regulations that supersede that, SB 88 doesn't allow us just to violate those agreements. But or there's other exemptions such as a person driving for medical or psychiatric emergency situation, person driving due to flood, fire, natural disasters, guardians, caregivers, or pupils driving themselves. If they're high schoolers and they're driving themselves to their athletics or extracurriculars, then they don't comply on it, or they don't have to comply with that. But I think a big question is who's regulating those 40 hours throughout the year? That's a big question. And so I'm pretty sure there's gonna be some questions on that. Kelly, do you have anything to add to the exceptions?
I don't. I think that's absolutely correct that, there's this particular exemption for the under 40 hours, I think is one of the ones that we'll see maybe not most, but many, many questions about. You hit the nail on the head with how is that being enforced and who's keeping track of that 40 hours. Also, what does it mean to make a reasonable effort to find a driver who doesn't, or who does, meet the qualifications? Another question that we're getting is what the notification might look like. So if you have, for example, a coach who's transporting students throughout a season, do you have to notify the parents for every individual instance of transportation, or is one notification sufficient? And those are all open questions. Good to be, consulting with legal counsel, but also your risk managers and JPAs on these issues as well as they come up.
Thank you. Next slide. We're going to cover now some of the specific requirements for the vehicles. And so the vehicles that fall under the criteria for SB 88 is they have to be carrying 10 or less, including the driver. Of course, we know that more than that triggers the commercial vehicle requirement. However, vehicles with a maximum capacity of 8 or fewer passengers, excluding the driver, must be legal coupes, sedans, light-duty vehicles. That includes vans, minivans, SUVs, and pickup trucks. And I think why the regulation or the law covers that piece is I believe there could be some possible SUVs, maybe even minivans or vans that can have that 9th seat. So I think it's defining for the vehicles that have 8 or fewer, what vehicles can be covered under that. Of course, seatbelts are required. First aid kits. I know that a key difference between the school bus and these alternative vehicles is there's specific units and a number of units that have to be within that first aid kit. However, SB 88 kind of leaves the discretion to the LEAs. Fire extinguishers are required with a minimum of 4 BC, and I know that's different from the school buses, which are no less than the 8 BCs. And then here's another hot topic that a lot of colleagues and with that in the transportation industry are discussing is vehicles must undergo a 19-point inspection every 12 months or 50,000 miles, whichever comes first, at a facility licensed by the Bureau of Automotive Repair. And so I think the Department of Ed has some clear distinction. Can LEA staff do the inspections just like our mechanics currently do the 45-day 3,000 on school buses? The answer is no. Doesn't mean we can't exceed that. We can still have the SB 8 or alternative vehicles that qualify under SB 88 still use the same criteria as school buses, for instance, like the 45-day 3,000 mile inspection. However, within the 12 months or 50,000 miles, whichever comes first, has to be inspected at a facility that's licensed by Bureau of Automotive Repair. Why that's in there, I think that's a good question. I think that's where David and Kevin were talking about the voicing our opinions. But my mechanics can't understand why they can inspect a school bus but not an alternative vehicle. So it's a great question, but that is within the law as it states currently. Kelly, anything to add?
No, I don't think so on this. Just I think there was a question about whether there's a difference between when the law applies to vehicles versus drivers. And I would say the trigger is the driver who's compensated to transport pupils, and then that would trigger both the driver requirements as well as the vehicle requirements.
Oh yeah, that's great. Like as far as whether exemptions and if the vehicle is required. Yeah, thank you for that.
Sure.
Okay, next slide, please. And LaFaye.
Hello, everyone. As you can see, it took a group of people from various backgrounds to pull this webinar together. And as I start talking about the roles and responsibilities of the different people in your districts, one thing you're going to recognize is that this large-scale change will require you crossing silos and working together, as with any large-scale change. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the responsibilities, the roles and responsibilities of a few people who will be key and instrumental in ensuring that SB 88 is instituted with fidelity. So first off, for the transportation director, and I'm so fortunate that I got to work with Rich on this because he's definitely on top of it. But first off, you have to know the law. You have to know what it says. Also, ensure that the appropriate district staff know the law, because the transportation director will not be able to implement all phases of this by himself or herself. So with any institution, with any change, with anything that's going on in an organization, if there's not one person who is in charge, nobody's in charge. So everybody can't be in charge. And one of the main things I would ask you to do within your organization is get knowledge from the superintendent or whoever it is to say, this is the point person. This is the person who's going to bring everybody together to ensure that we are compliant. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the director of transportation, but it has to be somebody. So the director of transportation needs to know who in the LEA is being transported by outside vendors or whoever's in charge of this. Talking to the special education director, we talked about those non-public schools. The purchasing director will be highly instrumental and active in this process with the RFP process. And then the McKinney-Vento liaisons as well. All of these people will need to be talked to. And depending on your organization, you'll be able to name many others who need to be included in this process. Slide, please. So the roles and responsibilities of others. So this is a risk mitigation effort. So definitely we are suggesting a sign-off declaration for the appropriate staff and time at leadership retreats. When you come back at the beginning of the year, when you have people who are putting together training for I would say IT compliance and all of those things, this is the time when you need to talk about that. And Rich, I think you were going to talk about these first two things.
Yeah, definitely. And so it's important as we communicate with our special ed department, risk management, purchasing, that we also we're communicating with the vendors, right? And so there's the attestation piece that we have to make sure that we're in compliant for. And every vendor is now required to show that this attestation, what it is, it's just a checklist, and I think we're going to provide a sample. It's a document that confirms that at the time of the contract, or whether you're getting into a contract or the current contract or the duration of the contract, that these vendors are in full compliance with all the applicable laws that exist in SB 88, which includes, the background checks, the first aid certification, the TB clearance, kind of a lot of the criteria that we have on the side by side in the beginning slides. We have to make sure that they're all compliant. And that's just a starting point. There's also like maybe like an audit part too, that as we communicate with the vendors and we're getting the attestation piece, that we're maybe doing an audit, and we don't have to do a full audit where we're checking every vehicle, every driver, but similar to what LEAs currently do for their highway patrol terminal inspection, is we're pulling sample sizes from the vendors. Maybe we check 5 drivers, or maybe it's a percentage of the vehicles or drivers that a contractor has. But we have to make sure that, we can't use the excuse that we didn't know. We have to be active. We have to communicate. We have to go out there, maybe go to a school site when that vehicle pulls up. Do they have that first aid kit? Do they have that fire extinguisher? But it's important because, this is very safety sensitive, that we have to do our diligence as LEAs, as transportation directors, to make sure that the vendors and the vehicles that our students are on are compliant. And then that's the next piece. But there's another piece that, all right, when a vendor isn't, or maybe if it's even a personnel, when they're not compliant, what do we do? How do we handle the non-conformity, and how are we documenting? Who are we communicating the non-conformity to? And so it's definitely a team effort as far as that goes, and we have to document each breach, and we have to have a proper response to whether it's the vendor or to the staff that's not compliant with all these requirements.
When Rich and I were talking about this, and we were talking about risk mitigation, we were talking about how we always like to plan from the lawsuit. We always like to think from that perspective. And if and when a lawsuit does occur, we want to make sure that everyone in the district has done everything that they can to not be held responsible, and to be extremely compliant with everything that they should. So that first bullet there about suggesting a sign-off declaration, that's done quite often so that we have proof that we have trained and told everybody involved what they are supposed to do, so that there's not an excuse down the road, like Rich said, I didn't know. Slide, please. So requirements for purchasing officials, and this is probably the group of people with RFPs who are usually the most involved in the RFP process. So again, know the law, connect with the transportation director to plan for the education of staff, including internal staff, for the response to nonconformity, and ways to properly document disciplinary measures. So if we have taught people what to do, and they have declared that they know what to do, and they choose to take chances, there has to be some response to that, whatever is appropriate at the time. But it can't just be, a talking to, because again, planning from the lawsuit, and Kelly, you can chime in on this if you want, word of mouth, or I told them, or all of that usually doesn't stand up. I've always been asked for, where's it in writing? What's your proof, and those types of things. And then ensure that the staff knows who is responsible for compliance of the new requirements, so that accountability can be upheld. We want to train people, we want to support them, but you also have to hold people accountable for doing what they're supposed to do. And Kelly, anytime you want to jump in here with that, just feel free to do so. Go on.
I was just going to say, one thing that we don't always think about is there's the possibility of, there's a violation of this new law, and someone challenges it, or it goes unnoticed. The other thing to, and those are risks, right? But the other thing to be aware of is that if something does happen, unfortunately, an accident or something like that, and in addition to that, the district was out of compliance with SB 88, that could heighten, or I guess lower the bar for proving a negligence claim against the district. So there could be other implications of this that could be pretty significant outside of just a straight lawsuit because you missed a step in the process. So just be aware of that.
Thank you. Slide, please. All right, requirements of human resources officials. So help educate and hold people accountable because, when I was in districts and in human resources, I felt that everything, began and end with me, not because I'm egotistical, but because I was responsible for the people part. And all of these initiatives, SB 88, everything happens with and through people. You can learn about the technical aspects of the job until the day is long, but all of these things get enacted through people, and people have to know what to do, but they also have to be held accountable. So as a human resources official, if that's your job, how do you know that you know? What's your documentation? What's your system for that? Know the law. Connect with the transportation director to educate, decide, and be supportive of nonconformity. I've worked with organizations in the past where you might have the director of transportation saying, this person is allowing this to happen and it's out of conformity, and they don't get support. So as human resources, just make sure that you're linking agendas with other silos so that there's an agreement about what will happen if, because the one thing that we know is that chances are something will happen and you'll have to course correct. So ensure that the staff knows who's responsible and so that accountability can be upheld. Slide, please. So this is a process for change. If you think about instituting SB 88 or any large-scale change, I believe that there needs to be a model for thinking about how you're going to institute this change. So I'll ask you to consider this for a moment. As you're looking at all of the technical aspects of the Senate bill, and as you're looking at all of the requirements and all of that, think about how in your organization you're going to institute this change, number one, on short notice and all of those things. So bottom line is, I believe that this Nostr model, I used to have it hanging up in a big chart in my office so that I could think through processes and also have conversations with everybody who was going to be responsible for instituting this so that I would know what they knew, we could talk through it, and we could plan. So number one, everybody who has to be a part of this has to know what the vision is. And I think Kevin started off beautifully with what the vision of SB 88 is. They need to know why you're asking them to do something. Because if they don't know why you're asking them to do that, you might get some false starts. If they don't have the skills to do it, which means the training and knowing exactly what their role and responsibility is, you're going to have frustration. If people don't have incentives, and in school districts, we generally do not have the ability to pay people more, but what incentives look like to me in school districts is people want to have some say, they want to have some knowledge, they want to see the big picture, they want to have the ability to engage in the how, even though they don't get to determine the what all the time. Without that incentive, you will likely get resistance. If resources are not there, and again, the resources here might be, some of the physical things that you need for the vehicles, where do you go to get inspected? But mostly here, the resources is the training. What do I do? What are the steps that I take? What do I do if, and all of those things? Who do I talk to? You get anxiety. People generally want to do a good job, but when something is new, they're going to have a lot of questions. And this is pretty new for everybody. We don't want people anxious. And then finally, if there's not an action plan, a coherent, organizational wide, well thought out action plan of step 1, step 2, and step 3, people will be confused, and you might have a lot of people doing random acts of greatness as opposed to following the steps in a cohesive way. So I'm just recommending that if you don't use this model, have some way of thinking about how you're going to bring about this change in your organization so that you have success, so that you have less frustration, and that number one, that students are being transported safely and that you're mitigating risks for the organization. Slide, please. And then finally, these resources are going to be provided for you. And I'm going to ask Rich to talk about what's included in each of these. But along with the recording, these will be provided after this webinar today: an LEA checklist, driver qualifications, and the vendor attestation checklist.
Thank you, LaFaye. And so the LEA checklist is just going to cover in bullet points and maybe with a little checkbox a lot of the components that we've already discussed. What should LEAs do to ensure not only internal staff but contracted staff are following the requirements in SB 88. The driver qualifications, it's going to be in a similar breakdown, but they're all samples and you can change them to fit the needs of your district. But again, it gets a little more into details of what the qualifications are for the driver specifically to qualify. And then the vendor attestation. Again, these are just samples. Feel free to manipulate them however you need to make sure that your district is in compliance. But also I want to stress that, as LaFaye just covered, the implementation of change, this is impacting a lot of districts and there's a lot of uncertainty. And I know with the budgets, the way they're looking for next year and the next couple years after that, is that we have to have in best practices too, maybe separate our costs. It's something I forgot to bring up earlier, is if that's a different resource or a different object code, but let's make sure that because we know that this new law is impacting us, and maybe there's increase in price with contracted vendors, that we want to target these costs, and just so that we can track of what the impact of this bill is doing, and so we can have an argument or show just the impact, what it is. But again, all these will be available. Feel free to change them up to fit your needs. And we know there's a lot of uncertainty, and so we want to be able to everyone on this webinar want to be able to assist everybody and make sure that we're all comply with this requirement.
Yeah. Then my final comment, I believe, would you slide, please? My final comment is just very simply pick a point person. Somebody has to lead the charge and bring everybody together. And it might be the director of transportation. It might not be, might be your human resources person or your purchasing person, but there has to be somebody who brings the team together to make sure it gets done. Thank you.
Great ending there, LaFaye. I couldn't agree more. I know that's one thing that you and Rich, and when we were all chatting before this, could not stress more. So I think that's a great point. Here we have everyone's on this webinar. We wanted to make sure that we were all open and accessible to everyone. So here is our email addresses. Should you guys want to reach out for anything? And I think we are going to probably take some questions as well, since it looks like we actually have some time. We're actually ahead of time, which is fantastic. So Courtney, you want to maybe hand out a few questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to comment. I haven't seen this many questions in a long time. So I'm going to restate the thing we said at the beginning. If your question doesn't get answered here, which it would be physically impossible for do in the next 14 minutes, we will get you an answer. We are also looking at doing a follow-up with CASTO where we can simply do Q&A. So like your questions will get answered, but we'll float a few here that seem kind of pervasive in terms of the number of times it was asked. So let's go with the first one. We outsource all the bus needs, home to school and SPED. Do we need to enforce SB 88 with our vendors? So I think a question around does vendor coverage help with compliance? So maybe Megan, could I start with you on that one? And then anyone else who wants to chime in?
Sure. I mean, I think regardless of what it is, whether it's SB 88, whether it's something you have in a contract, you should always be, I mean, if they say they're compliant, great, but you should always verify. I mean, that's part of the risk mitigation that LaFaye and Rich have talked about several times today. Rich mentioned, I believe he said, even a good way of auditing a company is doing this type of transport, ask them for a full list of their drivers. Maybe you choose, if they send over 20 drivers, maybe you choose 4, maybe you choose 5, like Rich said, and go through and do an audit, make sure that they send over the files on those drivers. I think it's trust but verify. It's always a good idea, and it's on you to ensure that they are doing it. So it's great that they say it. I know we at EverDriven actually, we certified compliance months ago for all of our districts, way ahead of implementation of July 1st. So I know many others out there are doing the same thing. So it's a good thing to just verify. Rich, do you have anything else to add?
You covered everything. I agree with everything that Megan said. It's our responsibility to make sure that they are in compliance.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. The next question we've seen a lot. I think, Kelly, this one will be for you. So I'll give a couple flavors of the question. What is the definition of compensated? First example, if a school employee, such as a coach, transports students to a game in a district, could take 40 hours. Someone here chimed in California traffic could be only 10 trips for 40 hours. Are they considered compensated because they receive a stipend, for example? How does this sort of non-driver role who could be driving fit into the regulation?
Thank you. Yeah, and we've seen that question come in as well from clients or questions in that vein. And so, I'm going to give the answer that everyone's going to love, which is we don't know at this point. And so we're just kind of thinking about these issues and how to best protect districts from a risk management standpoint. So, to the extent that a coach, for example, is getting a stipend and not included within their duties or expectations is transportation, but they're doing it on their own or they're voluntarily doing that, I think you can make a legal argument that they are exempt because they're not being compensated. But what I will tell you is that that's not a tested argument at this point, because as we know, this law has not technically even become operative yet. And so we may see challenges to that in the future. And so I think, again, the other thing I worry about is that, we see some districts trying to structure certain payment arrangements, stipends, et cetera, in such a way so that they expressly exclude transportation related services or providing transportation to pupils. And then it starts to look like we're trying to purposely avoid the implications of this bill. And it may be that this legislation intended to cover those situations. So bottom line, and I know, again, not always the most helpful answer to give, but I really do think it's an area where it's untested, it's gray. I would recommend consulting with legal counsel and your risk management folks on these types of issues, because sometimes when we have these gray areas, or really always, it's going to come down to, do we want to be most conservative, or is there a reason that we might need to take a little bit of risk to meet the practicalities of the situation?
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. So switching gears, which I think is a question for Rich, although you let me know. There were a couple of questions in here about vehicle inspection. I'll give a couple of flavors. On the vehicle inspection, so number one, why is it that district mechanics can't do vehicle inspections? But let's pair that with, do we need to inspect all vans before we start using them on July 1st? Maybe there's an umbrella statement there. And then secondarily, kind of who can do those inspections? Is that something, Rich, you'd be happy to chime in on?
Yeah, absolutely. So if it's, my recommendation, even if it's today, any driver that's going to transport students or staff should inspect that vehicle before they put it in motion. However, yes, July 1st, the requirement is that before that vehicle moves, that it's done with the proper vehicle inspection before putting staff or students on that. Second is when I first read the bill, I thought when I saw the bar, that the vehicle had to be inspected by a bar certified facility, I said, oh, easy, we'll just get bar certified. However, once I started going through to the certification process, because we're a public fleet, we cannot receive that bar certification. So therefore, I think that's why the Department of Ed clarified that LEA staff cannot meet that criteria of the 12 months or 50,000 miles. However, I think as a best practice, we're still going to keep a 45-day, 3,000-mile inspection, similar to what we do with school buses, because we can always go above and beyond what the requirement is. But that once a year or within the 50,000 miles, we will have it inspected by someone by the bar. I hope that answers that.
Yes, super helpful. Rich, one more question for you on this same. It seems like it is a yes or no question. Does SB 88 only apply to district-owned vehicles?
So if that's referring to a vendor that's their vehicles, this also applies to that vendor.
Great. So similar to kind of how Megan commented, if you're in the space of doing this type of transportation, if it is your vehicle in your district, you're responsible, and likewise responsible for trying to trust but verify with vendors that they're also compliant.
Exactly. And going back to the audit, these are inspections that we can ask to verify as well.
Okay, great. We have we have a lot more. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the training and background checks. There was a question overall about for individuals for whom background checks are not complete by 7/1, what does that mean? I don't know if that's one, Morgan, you want to chime in on, or what we should think about. Or Kelly, if you guys have thoughts on this, if the background checks are in flight, what sort of risk does that place post 7/1?
I mean, without having given that one too much thought, I would say, I mean, there's a technical risk of non-compliance, right? Because I think if we're talking about the outside vendors, they're supposed to have that written attestation that they're already in compliance. And then similar risk would apply to the extent it's not an outside vendor. But I would say if you're stuck, just try to, get that cleaned up as quickly as possible to bring that into compliance.
And also, really quick on that one, if it's a background check that they're waiting on, if they're driving right now, they shouldn't be driving right now because that's already a requirement prior to SB 88 is having that background check. So that should be done. So they shouldn't be driving until they have that background check regardless.
Yeah.
Awesome. Very helpful. Thank you. There was one other question relative to how this extends beyond K-12. So if you are a district that also runs programs for adult students where they are receiving transportation, does SB 88 also apply? I think, Rich, you're off mute, so.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine, I think for the adult transition programs, because we do have students that we transport from 18 to 22. However, I don't know, I mean, I know the bill doesn't specifically, I don't know if Kelly can chime in, but I would imagine so. I mean, we're going to require that because they're still our students no matter what. And I think the intent of this bill is for safety of students. And so whether they're 18 or 22, safety is still a top priority for us.
Yeah, and Rich, I would agree without having looked at that specifically. I don't see a distinction drawn. They don't define pupils in the bill as being limited. So that would be my best guess as well.
Okay, great. And one final, I want to make sure we cover this. Sorry, there's so many questions. I've lost my flow here for a second. It's a good problem to have. There is a question that's come in a couple times relative to parent volunteers driving automobiles, and does that change the policy for things like field trips? I have seen that kind of 4 times in here. I don't know, Kelly, if that's one you or Rich, you guys want to offer perspective on. If you're a parent driver transporting several children, how does this apply?
I would
Go
think
ahead.
that, oh, go ahead, Rich.
Oh, no, go ahead, Kelly. I was going to let you have it.
Okay, there is an express exemption for parents and relatives and guardians. So I would think as long as they're not being compensated and they're volunteering to transport students, that they would likely be exempt. But I would just give the caveat that there could be some nuance there where it's a parent who's also a coach or a parent who's also an employee or all different types of things. And I think you also mentioned board, to the extent there might be policies related to field trips, those would need to be checked as well. So I don't want to give a general answer across the board for all situations. I would just say that, yes, there is this exemption that could apply for the parents, but you'd need to look at the full context of the situation to make sure there isn't another reason why it does bring it in within the purview of SB 88.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have Veronica, I'm wondering if we can back up one slide to the resource slide, because I think to kind of wrap as we get to the top of the hour here, two things. Actually, I think a bulk of the questions that were asked were underneath similar umbrellas, so we will get back to you one-on-one. But to be clear, there were questions about training, there were questions about vehicle inspection, the LEA checklist, driver qualifications, the vendor attestation checklist. To remind you all, we didn't go through those in detail here. We are going to share them after the fact. So hopefully that helps answer a bunch of questions that may be outstanding. And secondarily, you will either hear from us one to few, or we will set a follow-on session for Q&A where everyone can come back and ask questions that they still have. But with that, what I'd like to say is that this has been an absolutely fantastic dialogue. There's nothing better than having real conversation, even though it's virtual, to try to get to the bottom of a challenge that many people are facing. So I'd like to for sure thank every one of our presenters today who's taken the time, and every one of you, I think more than 350 people who have shown up today for the hour to share your perspective as well. Do know you have the resources that we've noted here. And if Veronica, move to the last slide, as Megan noted, as LaFaye noted, any person who has offered perspective on this call, their contact information, if we go back one, yep, that's perfect, is right here. So you can grab the email addresses and you can follow up with your questions as you have them. And what is the phrase that chance favors the prepared mind? It sounds like there are many, many people here who are trying to be very prepared for 7-1. So we appreciate your efforts and everybody's dialogue today, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon. All right. Thanks all. Have a fantastic day. Take care.